My life obviously flashed before my eyes as Chidem did that quick summary. And it's obviously nice to know a life can be summarized in just a few sentences, could save a lot of bother. I guess in some ways, that's what I'm going to try and do with the settlement sequence on the Konya plain in the sort of southwestern part of central Anatolia, by talking about sites I've been involved in the excavation of and sites that other people have excavated in the Konya plain as at least one example of a settlement sequence spanning the development of sedentary behaviours, whatever that might mean. I'll explore that a bit more, and the emergence of larger scale settlements. Obviously, I put mega sites in the initial title. I'm a bit cautious about that term, but it is one that's bandied around a lot. And certainly, I think in this sequence, we can see the emergence of larger settlements towards the latter part of the sequence I'm talking about. Obviously, it's impossible in 55 minutes or so to summarize every aspect of recent project work, especially when I'm touching on Çatalhöyük as well, where a vast amount of work has been done. So I picked out a few themes, some that relate to the classic issues of looking at these millennia in Southwest Asia, the development of various forms of residential behaviours, food acquisition economies, for example, but other issues and aspects that are looked at regularly: identities, social differentiation, and continuity and change in household and community. But obviously, I'm leaving out a lot. I'm going to have to cover quite a lot relatively briefly in regards to each aspect, but that just means you've got plenty of opportunity to ask me any difficult questions or make comments as you see fit at the end. And obviously, I'm very happy to flesh out any points that I make with more detailed evidence. Oh, there we go. So obviously, I'll just start with the inset map here to show you the general area that I'm talking about, this part of the South Central Anatolian Plateau, 1,000 meters above sea level. And if we zoom in on the western part of the Konya plain, the Western Konya Basin, you can see a series of excavated sites here, of which I've been involved in directing excavations, a couple of them. Trevor Watkins, of course, initiated excavations at Pınarbașı, which at the moment is the earliest site in the sequence we're talking about. It's about 30 kilometers away, 30 kilometers away from the site of Boncuklu, which itself is about 9.5 kilometers away from Çatalhöyük. And that is the approximate chronological sequence in this part of the Western Konya Basin. But I will touch briefly on the site of Janasan 3 on the Ibrala Fan to the southeast. I'm not assuming necessarily a lot of previous knowledge here, although I'm sure that many of you know something about Çatalhöyük at least. So I will start by giving a brief snapshot synopsis of this sequence of sites before I pick up the themes, although I will introduce one or two aspects that I'll pick up in the themes. The sequence I'm dealing with starts in the Epipalaeolithic with the site of Pınarbașı. Here the state it is when Trevor Watkins and I visited it in probably 1993, possibly even slightly longer than I've known Chidem, where after further excavation in the early 2000s, we appreciated there was an Epipalaeolithic occupation in the rock shelter areas up to the left, between about 14,000 and 11,000 calibrated BC. Very briefly, this occupation seems fairly small scale in extent, but obviously was long lasting in terms of what appear to be repeated visits over the 3 millennia that I've outlined, each consisting of relatively short-term visits as represented by very small amounts of artifact scatter and thin exiguous occupation deposits. Clearly the site was then a residential settlement, but it was also a burial area in the same area as the occupation. You can see one of the burials on the left of the slide. We know a bit more now about residential practices, even though, as I said, they seem to be intermittent but repetitive in occupation of the rock shelter, because we've got some strontium and oxygen isotope evidence from one of the individuals, this little star on this graph, which clearly indicates this sort of dotted band here are the Pınarbașı soil leachates that provided isotopes as well, that in their childhood, this individual must have spent quite a lot of time, I think, in this area of the Konya plain. So this group didn't necessarily range regularly, particularly far in its round around the southern side of the Konya plain, probably going into the Taurus occasionally to extract materials as well. What we can say about this group as well, though, interestingly, is they had far-flung contacts. That's clear through exchanging materials like seashells and obsidian, and this starts a long sequence of this behavior in the area, but also in terms of various forms of ritual and symbolic practice, represented by things like cranial removal. This individual is lacking their cranium, even though their lower jaw is present, and things like the way that they have decorated shaft straighteners and the lunate types of microliths, which entertainingly are the largest tools at the site in the chipstone assemblage. So we have an Epipalaeolithic phase. The other thing I think it is worth saying about the Epipalaeolithic phase, as we now know from Mehmet Semel's team's ancient DNA work, that there's a lot of genetic continuity between this group exploiting the plain and groups in the early Holocene, such as that at Boncuklu that I'll talk about in a minute. 90% genetic continuity is evident. And as we now know, there's also significant sharing of, genetic heritage with the Çatalhöyük, but also slightly more widely in central Anatolia as well. So there's lots of evidence for genetic continuity in the plain has emerged recently, I think. In the 10th and 9th millennium BC, the site at Pınarbașı was resettled, but actually in an open area in front of the rock shelter in a pattern, of course, that repeats that of many other parts of Southwest Asia. This settlement shows some features that I previously referred to as sedentarizing. There's a lot more investment in site fixtures. There are semi-subterranean oval wattle and daub structures, for example. Big ground stone are installed in buildings. There are burials on the site again, not subfloor burials, but in open areas between buildings. And there's a lot of exploitation of particularly local wild nut resources from the surrounding hill areas, for example, terebinth and almond and hackberry, for example. The following site, and I'll show you the C14 dates in a minute, the site at Boncuklu actually is partially contemporary with the latter phases of early Holocene occupation at Pınarbașı, and runs a little bit later as well. As I said, we'll look at C14 dates in a minute. It shares some features with Pınarbașı in broad terms, these suboval semi-subterranean structures or sunken floored structures. But interestingly here, they're not built of wattle or daub, they're built of mud brick. And there's very clear evidence of a fairly intense occupation of the structures with many repeated floor plasterings. Here you can see a micromorphological block from one of the eastern parts of a Boncuklu building. You can see in this nice 3D scan of one of the more recently excavated buildings, the way that the floor areas are divided into what we call a clean, slightly raised southeastern area and a dirty area or kitchen area around the hearth. And we see that in the micromorphological evidence of the structure and use of the floors. These buildings have between 7 and 30 floor plasterings in the main floor area, often more in the kitchen areas. And that significantly exceeds those we see at Pınarbașı, where there's between 3 and 7 floor plasters using similar calcareous rich clays, for example. Following the occupation at Boncuklu, there's a scatter of late ceramic sites between about 7,500 and 7,000 BC, and it's at that period that Janissary III is occupied as well. But most of them seem to disappear to leave Çatalhöyük east from about 7,100, although possibly a little bit earlier. I'm sure the earliest bit of the site has not yet been excavated for obvious reasons. The Çatalhöyük east site, of course, does seem significantly different from a site like Boncuklu, which appears to be one of its direct predecessors, at least in the way that buildings aggregate closely together, and in the extent of the settlement, in terms of it covering 13 hectares. More recent work, especially detailed Bayesian analysis of C14 dates, has clearly suggested, however, that this sort of overall plan is a bit deceptive. Probably there were clusters of buildings separated by abandoned buildings as well as midden areas. So probably at any given time, the whole mound wasn't occupied in the way that we see in this plan, famously from the Melat area, south area of excavation. Some features show a lot of continuity with Boncuklu, even though the buildings are now rectangular, as they are at Cana Hasan III as well. There's still a clean, dirty division in the floors, albeit in a slightly different orientation. And there's lots of evidence of repeated building on the same location as well. So those seem to owe quite a lot to the behaviour of previous communities. And I'll come back to this theme of continuity and change. So I'm going to move on now to talk about some of these themes. And I want to talk first of all about questions of residential practices and issues of the way in which what we might call sedentary behaviours develop, and also a question of how much any given community might have been engaging in such sedentary behaviours at any time. I think we're starting to get some interesting insights into the sub-community level, household, individual level of residential behaviour as part of a broader picture of developing sedentary behaviours, if you like. And I think this is part of what we should understand of actually quite a complex picture of the development of sedentism. I won't deconstruct this grid for you immediately, but I think it shows you the way in which residential practices obviously have seasonal, multi-seasonal elements, but they also have questions of longevity from weeks to millennia of occupation, but also questions of continuity and intensity of occupation aren't often thought about enough. And I think if we start to break down our understanding of sedentism in this way, rather than just suggest it's an either or state or condition of behavior, you can see how all different sorts of sedentary communities might emerge in these areas of this grid, for example. And I think in the Konya plain in the 10th and 9th millennia BC, we can see exactly this. Communities that are adopting more sedentary practices, but vary significantly in terms of where they fall in the spectra of sedentary attributes. First of all, what about this question of longevity? And it allows me to quickly demonstrate the C14 dating on which the part of the chronological sequence I've mentioned before is based. In terms of longevity, impressively, the site of Pınarbașı is occupied somewhere between 12 and 1600 years. In very broad terms, apparently more or less continuously, although of course there could be seasonal and indeed annual or multi-annual breaks within that long-term commitment to the site. But in many ways, I would argue that surely some aspect of sedentary behaviour is a long-term commitment to residential locales. Boncuklu is also impressively long-lived, at a minimum of 700 years as well, although interestingly, somewhat shorter in its occupation than Pınarbașı. The other thing to flag, of course, that this means from about 8,300 BC to about 7,800 BC, we have two contemporary settlements in the Konya plain about 30 kilometres apart. To try to unpack this question of sedentism at these sites, we can look at the seasonality evidence, first of all. And again, I'm not going to go in great detail, but very quickly, you can see the way in which the Boncuklu evidence clearly shows, and the dark bars show frequent indicators of these seasons and minimal, if you like, occupations over months within these seasonality indicators. You can see that multi-season, multi-month occupation at Boncuklu is highly likely, and these are indicators with the dark bars that are distributed right through the sequence in some frequency. Pınarbașı clearly shows occupation in overlapping seasons, which suggests that we don't have two seasonally occupied settlements of the same community in these two contemporary sites. But there are indications that some seasons, particularly maybe later autumn, early winter, and maybe early summer as well, saw less clear-cut activity at Pınarbașı, although we have to be a little bit careful, of course, because of the classic, absence of evidence, and maybe the seasonal indicators are just not so strong for this forager community. But it does suggest differences here. There's differences too in the aspects of continuity and intensity that I've talked about previously. I've already said how many more plaster floors each of the buildings at Boncuklu have, and I think that's part of the story. At Boncuklu, however, I think we can go a bit further in identifying continuity and intensity. This is on the right of the slide. You see a Bayesian analysis of a sequence of C14 dates from 6 structures, one on top of the other, representing a reconstruction of the same building over a period of between about 60 and 120 years, according to the Bayesian analysis. The floor counts of the main areas of the building, the clean areas of the building, indicated here. There's the sequence of 6 buildings on the left. And you can see there's quite a lot of variability in the number of floors, but in total, we're talking about 75 floors, which I think would work well for an annual laying of the main floor of the building, maybe with occasionally potentially use for a floor for another year as well. But I think that indicates some of the intensity of the refurbishment and use of the buildings. And going with each of these floors, there's a shifting of features and fixtures that suggest, some intensity of use of the structures. And I think the micromorphological evidence, particularly Aroa Garcia Suarez, who may well be part of the audience, unless she's left by now in disgust, has helped document. There's other aspects of intensity and continuity that are very strong at Boncuklu and maybe also contrast a bit with Pınarbașı. So, for example, people are buried under house floors at Boncuklu, and we now know from some ancient DNA analysis that the people buried under sequences of house floors are closely genetically related. These are, you see, the pink burials are first-degree genetic relationships between people buried under this sequence of floors. Whether these people all lived in these buildings, I think, is a bit of a moot point. Clearly, they're affiliated with these structures. And I think ancestry here is a strong part of constructing continuity in these buildings. And remember, at Pınarbașı, we don't quite have that subfloor burial sequence that we see at Boncuklu, which is interesting. The relationships probably are complex, though. I would say. I don't think this necessarily points to some sort of immediate nuclear family relationships. For example, there's a neonate buried here with an adult female who is not genetically related to her or anyone else that we could identify the genetic evidence from this particular set of buildings. So it's still perhaps a complex picture of affiliation, despite this strong aspect of genealogical ancestry. And finally, from the carbon and nitrogen isotopes, we can say that this adult male, who's the son of this adult female to the south on this plan of building 14, he actually, although he was probably born in the area, the locality, and spent his childhood there, he probably spent at least a decade preceding his death at some distance from the site of Boncuklu, either through regular seasonal absences, or he may have gone away completely, but he came back to be buried in this building. So I think you can see we're starting to unpack what sedentism means in terms of individual behaviours as well. And I want to come back to this strontium and isotope evidence to look at that a little bit and bring out more of the contrast between Boncuklu and Pınarbașı. Most of the Boncuklu individuals that you see as the males of the black circles, the females of the open circles from Boncuklu, they all fit with being brought and spending their early childhood in the Boncuklu locality. Apart, when I say all, I'm going to say apart from 2 individuals, an adult male who actually falls in the same zone as the Pınarbașı individuals, and an adult female who probably spent a lot of time away from the site in her childhood to the south, or actually moved to the site after her younger childhood from a settlement or community to the south. The Pınarbașı group is very interesting because they do cluster together, so they presumably spent their childhoods in a similar area. But interestingly, these strontium and especially the oxygen signatures would suggest they did spend some time at areas further to the north than that in which Pınarbașı is located. And I think this would point to maybe regular seasonal absences from the site, even though it represents such a long-term occupation. And of course, it fits with the other evidence we have from perhaps a less strong signature of continuity and intensity of occupation. So I think we can start to show the way in which sedentary behaviours didn't develop necessarily as a uniform phenomenon on the Konya plain. In terms then of the second theme, food acquisition, and obvious questions about the scale of cultivation relative to plant collection and intensity and scale of hunting relative to animal management and herding, I think we have a lot of interesting and good evidence now. Here we see the representation of some of the classic cultivars at these various sites, including Canasan 3 and Çatalhöyük, to have the full sequence. And I think these bar graphs of the ubiquity and frequency of cereals very clearly indicate the way in which at Pınarbașı, right from the Epipalaeolithic, when we're presumably talking about the wild ancestors of these species, and at Pınarbașı, there's very little interest in these plants, actually, pretty much zero interest as far as we can tell from our current evidence. At Boncuklu, domesticates are clearly present, but interestingly, frequency and ubiquity are not that high, and diversity actually compared to the later assemblages is not so high either. And you can see a clear increase in intensity of cereal cultivation, I would suggest, through the Canasan into the Çatalhöyük early Prehistory Neolithic periods at Çatalhöyük. So that's looking at the earliest phases at Çatalhöyük, obviously. So there really is an intensity of an increasing intensity of cultivated plant exploitation through this sequence. At Boncuklu, we can tell the crops are grown locally, probably in small patches near wetland areas. The phytoliths help us localize that. And I think we can see this as part of what might be called low-level food production, as Bruce Smith has called it, for example, but one that was sustained, it would appear, over a period of time. That we're not just talking about a brief phase preceding the adoption of larger scale cultivation, but after all, we're talking about certainly 500 years of this low-level food production. This neatly matches, I would argue, evidence for animal exploitation at Boncuklu. At Boncuklu, probably cattle provides the most meat. Actually, we now know that pig, boar, it would appear from the morphometrics, are probably the most frequently hunted animal, but cattle, wild cattle, provides the most meat. Not so different from Pınarbașı in terms of the cattle significance, but interestingly, a contrast in boar exploitation, which is very uncommon, relatively speaking, at Pınarbașı. So there are contrasts in the animal exploitation as well as plant exploitation between these two contemporary sites. We don't see a significant arrival of definitely domestic caprines until the early levels at Çatalhöyük, when they're clearly highly frequent, although cattle would have still provided meat. Their status, well, I can talk about that, and I think it remains an interesting question about what's happening with the cattle in the early levels at Çatalhöyük. Nevertheless, at Boncuklu, even though caprines are a very small, less than 5% at the site, there does seem some hints that perhaps they are being managed in some way. Some of the caprine isotopes have elevated nitrogen, for example, that is typical of the later Çatalhöyük domestic animals, and quite a contrast with the earlier and contemporary animals at Pınarbașı, for example. And Arrowa has detected herbivore dung in fuel and a few other contexts at Boncuklu too. So probably they were keeping quite small numbers of sheep and goats somewhere in the vicinity of the site for some period of time, as part of, I would argue, just the beginnings of low-level management. I think we've now got some clues as to what happens between Boncuklu and Çatalhöyük in terms of the adoption of animal management, because Caroline Middleton's carbon and nitrogen isotope studies of the Canasan 3 caprines clearly show high proportions of animals with elevated nitrogen and C4 plants in their diet that I think mark the shift towards the domestic regime at Çatalhöyük. So just as with plants, there's an increasing intensity of animal management. And this is further borne out, I think, by recent H&DNA work from Emmett Summel's team at Meto, where we see a diverse set of haplotypes of the same haplogroup before 7,500 BC, but it's during the occupation of Canasan that we see a dramatic narrowing of the genetic diversity of the local caprine populations, I think, that point to domestication, this work recently published. So that fits this pattern that I've been talking about. While I am talking about plant and animal management, I will just touch on some aspects relating to this. And one of the things that struck us early on about the Boncuklu site was how there's hardly anything in the way of fixtures and fittings at the site within buildings but indeed more generally, that might relate to significant levels of plant storage or other forms of storage indeed. We visualize it in these visualizations as possibly occurring within baskets, so mobile and smaller scale storage probably within the structure, but not the building of fixtures. And I think this points to a relatively modest amount of storage capacity, especially given the rather small size of some of these domestic structures. You can see the amount of space adults lying down, sleeping would have taken up. So we're not talking about a lot of space, especially if you allow the co-presence of these baskets. So storage seems to be very, very modest to the extent it existed at all. You might then say, you know, Boncuklu, a site with such strong evidence, I think, of continuity and intensity of occupation, how is it maintaining those sedentary behaviours without significant quantities of storage? And I think the diversity of animals, in particular, and plants to a degree as well, that are exploited at Boncuklu is what probably sustained the long-term commitment and intensity of occupation of this locale. We have lots and lots of fish, waterfowl, tortoise on the site, and it seems that these are being exploited along with the wetland-loving large mammals they focus on too. And we've even got frogs and water voles, for example, in the human coprolites from the site. So it is clear they really are eating these animals, and I think that diversity supports the sedentary behaviours as we understand them from Boncuklu. To move quickly on, because we don't have lots of time, to questions of identities. One of the things that struck me about these sites, Boncuklu in particular, but I think this applies to Pınarbașı as well, and to a degree possibly Çatalhöyük if one allows certain amounts of continuity. We can talk about that towards the end if you like. But there's a strong indication of the importance of identity expression in quite material ways by these communities, I would argue. And when I'm talking about identity here, I'm talking about a number of attributes of identity that, of course, interact in various ways. So I'm going to touch briefly on evidence for individual, gendered, household, corporate group and community identity expression and strong identity marking, as I would see it. And I think this is important when we move on to talk about the fourth theme. I'll talk about social differentiation. In terms of individual identities, I think it's strongly marked in a range of the artifact repertoire. We have a large number of these decorated stones. Some of them are simple plaques, some are tools. You can see an elaborate range of decoration here, some perhaps representational to a degree, some more geometric. The point is that I think we've got about 150 of these items now. No two items are identical through a combination of shape, size, and decorative motifs, although some motifs do repeat quite a lot, more than at other sites, which might indicate some group and a community identity. But there's lots of other indications as well. The site isn't called Boncuklu for nothing, beady place. There's lots of marine shells, for example, here, all of the shells that made up probably a girdle around the waist of a child. But lots of different sorts of stone beads at Boncuklu in particular, and all sorts of elaborate pendants as well, that show, I think, that individual identity expression was really important. Whether or not the burials that have some of these beads, for example, whether or not people wore those very beads in that particular configuration in life, I don't think is particularly important to this argument. Clearly, these things were used in life and different configurations were evident. So individual identity expression is strong here, I would suggest. And partly that is because I see these small plaques and especially the tools, obviously, as portable objects carried around by individuals, but deployed in social settings. In terms of gender, there is some evidence of gendering practices, identity practices, I think, and it comes in various forms. Interestingly, I think it comes in food consumption. There is a statistically meaningful difference between male and female diet indicated by carbon and nitrogen isotopes, but there's also relates to things like the objects that people made and possibly used as well. So we have lots of these very large numbers of these geometric clay objects, and Lucy Benison-Chapman was able to study the fingerprints on these objects to show that the majority of them are made by adult females, for example. There are a few with male fingerprints, but it seems this was more regularly a female action. So whilst one shouldn't imagine the gendered behaviours and related identities as completely exclusive, I think, interestingly, there are strong tendencies, I would suggest. Other aspects of identity seem to be represented at the household level, whatever that might exactly mean, or in relation to people, networks affiliated with particular buildings. And we started to see that in the genetic evidence of ancestral continuities in the burials under the buildings. But the way the buildings are continually reconstructed in the same location over these dead associated with the household suggests that the continuity of the household is important. And the material, the symbolic expression of that continuity is important. And I think that must be seen as part of identity as well. And that plays into the evidence that we have that the way that these buildings are often decorated as part of ritual and symbolic practice is often quite idiosyncratic. We do have several bucrania of one sort or another, or cattle horns in different buildings, but they all have different configurations, including this imaginative reconstruction of a double cattle head bucrania in one building, building 4, the plan on the right. But other buildings have boar jaws in walls, others have a single horn, cattle horn next to the entrance, for example. And of course, these are all bits of animals as well. And one of the things we shouldn't forget is the dismemberment of the animals that went to create these identities, which also maintain links between the people that dismembered the animals and shared their parts as well, of course. Other hints of perhaps household or local area identities, I think, come in the rather differentiated practices of burial in the site. There are, as I said, burials under the building floors. There's quite a lot of variability in the numbers of burials, but interestingly, there's quite a lot of variability in the proportion of grave goods between those different sequences of buildings at Boncuklu that I've mentioned already. For example, the adults in the building 12, 14, 5 sequence don't have any grave goods at all. There's a child with some grave goods, whereas the average in other buildings is 33% of the burials have grave goods, for example. Interestingly, there's a contrast between the burials in the open spaces and in the buildings, but also between different external areas. So particularly in one area, area M, up to 58% of the burials in the external areas had grave goods. So I think there are household traditions, if you like, group traditions of identity expression indicated in the material of the house, but in the burials as well. And I think this is also borne out by the dietary evidence from carbon and nitrogen isotopes as well, where, for example, in the building 12 to 5 sequence, it seems that the adult males in that sequence had similar diets, and the adult females did as well, expressing a more site-wide gender difference at the same time. Another aspect of a contrast between the external and the internal burials is the way that the internal burials are all completely attacked. Some of the external burials, like this individual on the top left, are completely articulated burials, but some are secondary. There's evidence of skull removal as part of the mortuary treatments in these external areas, and skull circulation and deposits of caches of skulls in pits or individual skulls in pits as well. And here again, I think we have evidence of corporate group behaviour and identity cross-cutting household practices as well. Because when we look at the carbon and nitrogen isotopes of the skulls in these secondary practices in the external areas, we see that their carbon and nitrogen isotopes are rather different from the burials under the house floors. The burials under the house floors tend to show higher nitrogen and carbon on this area of the axis. And interestingly, that might equate with eating more meat or eating more aurochs in particular, that's high in nitrogen too. The skulls show perhaps the eating of more fish, waterfowl and tortoise, and maybe plants as well. So it seems like a group of people who were buried in external areas shared food in a way that contrasted them with people buried under the houses. And I think that's a corporate group that presumably actually derived this food partly from the communal tasks in which it was engaged and contributed to corporate identities spanning individual households. Some of these people must have lived in some of the houses that we've excavated, of course. And the final level of identity I want to talk about relates to community level identities. And this goes back to the contemporaneity of Boncuklu and Pınarbașı, of course, where you've already started to see really quite strong differences in behavior, difference in exploitation of plants, for example, different hunting practices with a focus on boar at Boncuklu. We don't see at Pınarbașı, even though there would have been plenty of wetlands close by. So really interesting things like that, different intensities of residential practice, and perhaps different nature of seasonal exploitation of the landscape between the two sites that we've looked at. But there are other interesting differences in the sort of identity expression I just talked about as well. So, for example, there's a lot fewer decorated plaques and stone tools at Pınarbașı relative to area excavated. There's large numbers of the geometric clay objects I've mentioned already at Boncuklu and none at Pınarbașı. The nature of the beads and pendants is rather different as well. And of course, the building construction is different, with mud brick at Boncuklu and wattle and daub at Pınarbașı. So there's a whole plethora of differences here that I think mark contrasting community identities. And I think these relate partly to the foraging and landscape engagements I've talked about already, contrast perhaps in the adoption of cultivation, but you could argue that they're very much framed in the different identities that these communities have anyway. And I mark these diversities, I think, as indicating an interesting phenomenon that's more often been associated with urbanism and early urbanism. I'm adapting here these concepts of polycentric urban regions, for example, that apply in modern geography, often pointing out how settlements cluster when they have complementary sets of behaviours that can be often maintained by different identities as well. So I think these different identities would have benefited from and benefited sedentary community clustering as well, and should be understood as an important part of the emergence of early sedentary practices, which should be seen as far from a uniform phenomenon, as I think we've sometimes perhaps led ourselves to believe. What about questions of social differentiation then? I think I still have a bit more thinking. We've got a bit more analysis to do about this, but I wanted to raise it and tantalise you with some of our provisional thoughts in this regard. And when we're talking about social differentiation, I use that term advisedly. Obviously, we're talking about quite complex forms of differentiation that could be possible. What might often be called horizontal as opposed to hierarchical variables, as well involved in that classic split between heterarchy and hierarchy. But we're also talking about different attributes of differentiation as well: status, power, resource accumulation, political control. All of these are actually different dimensions of interrelated phenomena. I don't think we can assume coincidence between them, and they're difficult to explore, I would suggest, but we can start to explore them, and I think we do have interesting evidence. Typically, people have turned to burial variability, of course, to look at this, and that's a complex issue because, of course, for example, people try and associate the grave goods with particular individuals and perhaps suggest that these in some ways belong to those individuals. And I think there's all sorts of reasons we should be very cautious about that. And similarly, the way in which bodies might be treated. But generally, the view has been there isn't a great amount of variability in a lot of these features, a lot of sites. And this also perhaps applies to things like variability of house size and elaboration. And people have used the term, sometimes carefully maintained, that egalitarianism as a way of interpreting this, or aggressive egalitarianism, perhaps, to cite Ian Kite, who was certainly here earlier, and Ian Hodder as well, for example. I think this is complex. Clearly, it's variable, and it might well be that individual identities and statuses are reflected here. I think, you know, one of the interesting things that was noted about the Çatalhöyük burials was their biographical characteristics, if you like, the way in which the grave sets might somehow tell stories about individuals, whether those are the stories those individuals experienced, or what the community or perhaps the household or corporate group wanted to say about those individuals, an interesting question. So I would see these expressions of biography as communally, corporately, or household mediated phenomena, rather than necessarily some sort of deliberate expression or control of egalitarianism. But we do get a lot of variability. So here's a little set of stone artifacts, obviously of non-immediately local materials, quite big and presumably moderately valuable tools, buried with one individual in area M. This is one of the biggest blades, opposed platform blades that we know from the Neolithic, for example. And it's in flint. Most of our tools are obsidian and they're tiny little microliths. So that's a really interesting statement of the burial, of the use and burial of this exotic object technologically as well as material-wise. So it does show you, I think, the way in which material distinctions are being deployed here. But whether they relate to individual status or hierarchy is a difficult question to resolve. And I think they are mediated through the corporate aspects that I've mentioned already of the deposition of grave goods that we see in the way that different house sequences have different ways of including material with individuals. I think that leaves us with perhaps other sorts of evidence, even though the material is tantalizing, and that is to look at things like architectural variability. Now, we've excavated over 20 buildings now, in part or completely at Boncuklu. And interestingly, most of the buildings are pretty small, as you saw from those visualization plans earlier, certainly smaller than most of the Çatalhöyük buildings, for example. But we do have one exceptionally large building that emerged last season. So this is very fresh news, building 22, which is much bigger than any of the other buildings and has a rather different internal layout, including two hearths, one obviously not in the northwestern sunken area. There isn't an obvious clean, dirty area. The floors are made in a non-standard way. So it does seem to be a rather different sort of building, but it's still nowhere near as big as some of the communal buildings at sites like Boncuklu or further east. So we rather see this as some sort of residential structure. And the presence of cooking items that might be associated with cooking, like clay balls in the building, I think is telling in that regard as well. So we have one big building out of just over 20 sort of smaller normal sized buildings. And I think this is an interesting indication of household differentiation, at least. One other building stands out as well, and this is the only example we have of a built storage fixture, which is stuck on the outside, but next to the entrance of this building, building 6. So this building has, in a very public place, interestingly enough, this isn't a little hidden indoor pantry, as some people have argued about, you know, early food storage related to autonomy. This is a very publicly visible statement of storage capacity. How often it was full, I don't know, associated with one of the average buildings as well. So here we have interesting evidence of variability, I think, that also relates to, I think, identity assertion, I would call it, that suggests maybe some households are marking themselves out in notable ways from others. So forms of social differentiation, but I would suggest that the evidence is so unstructured and irregular that we're really talking about a situation of very fluid and dynamic changing social statuses and relationships, a situation perhaps in which there's a lot of regular negotiation and renegotiation of people's importance and role and households' importance and role in society. So I want to finish off with my final theme, which relates to continuity and change, by starting to talk a little bit more about Çatalhöyük with reference to this preceding sequence. I've listed here some of the things that seem to change, but some of the things that reflect continuity. There's a lot of evidence of continuity, I think, indications of the possibility of genetic continuities, the localized focus of predominant subsistence for these communities, the same domestic space configurations, albeit with a different orientation. I've mentioned clay balls now, similar cooking indications. Lots of continuities in the nature of household ritual and symbolic practices. Of course, the domestic space use aspects demonstrate as well. And I would argue from what at least Ian Hodder has been publishing recently about the rather fluid and dynamic and unstructured evidence that there might be for differentiation of the site, the same sort of fluid social differentiations and significance of identity expression that we see at Boncuklu, for example. Interestingly, less so at Pınarbașı. So lots of evidence of continuity that, of course, intriguingly cross-cuts the evidence for change that we have. The biggest changes I've talked about already, the most notable large-scale community-wide ones are, of course, the major shift to the predominance of cultivation and herding for the Çatalhöyük community, the increased community scale, and overall the bigger residential structures and household packing relative to the earlier sites. Of course, I've already said you can't see Çatalhöyük as a completely built up area. Nevertheless, there are real contrasts here. Something I haven't quite touched on, however, is the appearance of the regular presence of storage fixtures at the Çatalhöyük site. And this might be argued to be evidence of increasing household autonomy in the contrast and the transformation from Boncuklu through a Janusant 3 type arrangement potentially to Çatalhöyük. The other one, of course, I'll explore a little bit in a moment, is also been more recently mentioned, which is the way in which the co-burials seem to represent a corporate dimension to affiliation between households. But let's just talk a little bit more about the storage evidence. Remember that most Çatalhöyük houses seem to have side rooms with lots of storage bins. We don't see much like that at Boncuklu, as you gathered. So storage capacity has significantly increased. I'm sure that this, and certainly people looking at buildings like Building 52, where there was burnt material to indicate the presence of bags and baskets, the built fixtures are also accompanied by the baskets and bags of the type we might see at Boncuklu in small spaces within buildings. The capacity of the storage structures in the Çatalhöyük structures the buildings are very variable, of course, and that's something we need to bear in mind. That very much fits the pictures I think I've already been showing you from Boncuklu. But interestingly, what seems to be present here is a year's worth of plant food storage, probably mainly, plus maybe 50 to 100% extra, which would provide a buffering year. This allows a degree of autonomy for the household, but I don't think we can associate it with a high degree of autonomy. So a bit like I see a spectrum of sedentism, I see these changes in the early levels of Çatalhöyük as pointing to a shift along the potential for autonomy, the capacity for autonomy, if you like, without necessarily the full development of household economic autonomy. And I think the people that have studied this evidence from Çatalhöyük point to the way in which there are networks that link houses together. And of course, the food storage might have been part of that too. Running out of time, so I'll skip a couple of slides and just talk about some of the emerging evidence for these networks at Çatalhöyük and how in some ways they sort of represent actually continuity with Boncuklu in particular. It was pointed out some time ago, of course, by both Hodder's team and by people like Blade working on the architecture. There was a lot of variability in numbers of burials between these structures at Çatal, and some buildings seem to have too many people buried in them. And quite possibly there were people buried in from other households, or perhaps if households extend over multiple buildings, there was a central structure within such arrangements. But we're talking about distributed networks of alliance and allegiance, therefore. And some of the more recent evidence pointing to genetic relationships, whether the biological distance markers indicated by teeth from Aaron Pilar's work, or the direct ancient DNA evidence from multiple, particularly child burials in the Çatalhöyük buildings, show the way in which a lot of people co-buried, in contrast to the Boncuklu situation, in houses don't have direct, at least first degree genetic relationships. So this suggests quite complex networks, and the work of Camilla Mazzucato and I think Christina Serrati with Ian Hodges also showed the way in which there are probably quite widespread networks affiliated together and sharing resources and perhaps food as well. Pearson's work on the stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen share a lot of commensal practices, even though there is this genetic diversity within individual buildings. So I think, interestingly, a situation where we have corporate groups involved in commensal behaviour, burying in external areas, is continued but transformed with the inclusion of such corporate group burials within the structures at Çatalhöyük, where, of course, there's a lot less open space for people to practice inter-household social interactions. So I think there's, again, interesting evidence of continuity and change. And I think whilst the development of storage facilities points to increasing economic autonomy, probably related to the increasing importance of plant domestication, potentially these stores in buildings, just like the dead were, the ancestors were stored in the buildings as well, might be part of more widespread networks anyway. And that's possibly why storage capacity and indeed cooking installations are variable between buildings at Çatalhöyük. So just to finish off, I think, in this situation of significant economic developments through time and developments in residential practices, I think there's a lot of evidence that ancestry and corporate group behaviours and ritual and symbolism continue, and probably also continue to constrain social differentiation that operated in a fluid and dynamic way, in a process, one might say, of always becoming but never being institutionalized, which is the contrast between these communities and those probably of the Bronze Age, although whether that contrast is perhaps quite as marked as we think is an interesting question as well. I'll stop there because I'm running out of time. Thank you.